I'm so happy to see everybody here this evening. Thank you for coming.
My name is Annette Henry. I'm the David Land Chair in Multicultural Education in the Faculty of Education. And the David Land Chair, this is where I visited it, is supposed to promote scholarship and engagement around social justice and critical race studies and about the university and in the community and beyond. So the lecture series is part of doing that, and so thanks again for coming. I'd like to thank all of the co-sponsors, the Institute for Race, Gender, Sexuality and Social Justice, the Department of Philosophy, and
Okay, come on now. Come on. We're talking about equity here.
and the Department of Political Science. And thank you very, very much to all the volunteers. So this is definitely not a one-woman show. There are many people, and I'm not going to name them, but many people who helped this day happen. And I want to say personally how much Patricia meant to me and her work when I was a graduate student, and her work, her groundbreaking book, Black Feminist Thought, had come out just in the nick of time for me. And it's been a pleasure for me to watch her thinking develop and grow. And I have to say what a pleasure it's been these 2 days for her to be with students and faculty and just to sit at her feet. She's a marvelous, amazing scholar and human being. Now my colleague and representative in gender, race, sexuality and social justice, Jay Pollard-Crowe, to begin the evening. Thank you.
Okay. Hello and welcome. Can everybody hear me? Great. Hello and welcome to the David Land Chair of Multicultural Education Public Lecture Series. It's wonderful to see so many people here this evening. My name is Jay Pollard-Crowe, and I'm a master's student in the Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice Institute here at UBC. I would like to begin by taking this opportunity to acknowledge that our event will take place on the traditional, ancestral, unceded and occupied Indigenous territories of the Musqueam people. As guests to this beautiful land, we are thankful and consider it a privilege to be able to live and do our collective learning here today. We continue to maintain a deep-rooted commitment to ongoing anti-colonial work and understand our positionality as settlers upon lands that was obtained through a process of displacement and colonial violence. Okay. So I am absolutely thrilled to be able to present our distinguished guests this evening. And as such, I'd like to give thanks to Professor Annette Henry for making this event possible. We are exceptionally fortunate to have Patricia Hill-Collins in our midst. Professor Collins is a social theorist whose scholarship has examined such concerns as power, community, race, sexuality, gender, socio-economic conditions, and nation. I would personally add that her book titled Intersectionality gave one of the most insightful and helpful breakdowns of a term many of us employ so frequently. So, Professor Hill-Collins is Distinguished University Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and Charles Taft Professor Emerita of Sociology within the Department of African American Studies at the University of Cincinnati. Her award-winning books include, get ready for it, she's written a lot, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, which received both the Jessie Bernard Award of the American Sociological Association, ASA, and the C. Wright Mills Award of the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Black Sexual Politics, African Americans, Gender, and a New Racism, which received ASA's 2007 Distinguished Publication Award. She is also author of Fighting Words, Black Women and the Search for Justice, From Black Power to Hip Hop, Racism, Nationalism and Feminism. Another Kind of Public Education, Race, Schools, the Media and Democratic Possibilities. The Handbook of Race and Ethnic Studies, edited with John Solomos. On intellectual activism, race, class and gender, intersections and inequalities. Ninth edition, co-edited with Margaret Anderson, and intersectionality, co-authored with Sperma Bilsch. Professor Collins has taught at several institutions, held editorial positions with professional journals, lectured widely in the United States and internationally, has accepted as consultant for a number of community organizations and served in many capacities in professional organizations. In 2008, she became ASA's 100th president, the first African-American woman elected to this position in the organization's 104-year history. In 2017, she was the recipient of ASA's William B. Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award, and in 2018, the Association of Black Sociologists awarded her the Joseph Sandy Hines Award for Lifetime Scholarship. Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, her most recent book, is scheduled to be published by Duke University Press this year, which we anticipate. Tonight, Professor Hill Collins will deliver a talk titled Black Feminism and Anti-Black Racism, Challenges and New Directions. This talk feels particularly timely as we have continued to witness the global rise of the right, and as such have seen prior forms of racism and gender oppression find new forms of articulation. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
So let's try out this mic and see how it's working. It seems to be working. Yeah, where do you want to do that? Oh, that was really a lovely introduction. And to be honest with you, I actually did all of that. So by the time you guys finished, I was feeling a little tired. Like maybe I should go lie down and take a break. But I'm not going to do that. Because the nature of doing intellectual work is to always push yourself, to take your ideas and take them one step further, to take them to new people, to travel, to think big thoughts, and to be willing to come back and rethink your own position. The world that I'm going to talk about in this talk, this is a heavy-hitting talk. I'm going to prepare you for that. It is about black women, it is about anti-black racism. It may make some people uncomfortable, but what we all have to keep in mind is we inherited this world. We did not make these things by ourselves. Most of us in this room were not born when a lot of the foundation that we're dealing with today started. But it is our responsibility to take it forward in a good way. We are responsible from here on. So there's no stepping back and saying, oh, you know, the world is just finished and I can't do anything. We can each do something. So what I'm doing today is to provide you, hopefully, with a diagnosis of starting in a very different place for how you do theoretical work. I'm not starting with the top. I'm not saying here are the big daddies of theory. And there usually are big daddies of theory. You can pick your particular god as you worship, whoever that may be in the academy. And then we apply those ideas to everyone else. I work from the bottom up. I believe that if you work with the particularities of people's lives and experiences, in terms of how they're living them and how they are analyzing them, you get a much richer theory that will help with questions of social justice. So that's the talk that I've come to give today. And I actually like this talk a lot. Right? So I should be pretty heavy. And I also say to people, if your neighbor seems to be dozing off, please wake that person up for me. All right? It makes me feel bad when I see people toppling off the chairs because I'm so boring, right? So we're not going to go to that space. I've been writing about Black feminism for a long time because I honestly think that Black women's experiences are very particular, but they're also quite universal. They're a window into universal ideas. I push back against the norms of the Western Academy and say, oh, there's feminism and then there's Black feminism. As if there was a feminism there before there were Black women. Or that some group of feminists come up with the feminism and the rest of us have to figure out how to assimilate and squeeze our way into it. I don't think that's the way we should be working. So that's not the way I'm going to work today. And I take a similar perspective around racism. Racism is a sensitive topic for people. Part of it is because we don't break it down to its varieties. Racism against indigenous people, racism against Black people, racism against Palestinian people, racism against and against and against and against. Instead of having this one overarching, generic, universalistic, kind of paddling view of racism, we squeeze the particularities out of it. So I'm going to be talking today about something called anti-Black racism, which we can position within a pantheon of variations of racism, if you will. But I think when you talk about Black women and you talk about anti-Black racism, that grounds the analysis in a particular way that is important for me. Are you ready to roll? Shall we do this? Let's go. Here's the overview. My talk is in two parts. The first part of the talk, I will be talking about Black feminism and anti-Black racism through the lens of the U.S. I am not arguing that this is another framework that we should use to apply to everyone else's experiences. Instead, I'm going to get inside that framework and try and present to you the way I view the origins, the development, the themes of Black feminism in the United States, because I think it's instructive. But I also think that that is a particular form of Black feminism. So the second part of my talk, I want to broaden that lens out, still grounded in African American women's experiences and ideas, but to ask the question, what about Black feminism in Black diasporic context? What about the other Black feminisms in the world, if you would use the word other, the multiple Black feminisms in the world? And is there something called the Black diaspora that is simultaneously a political construct and a cultural construct? And that would be the Black diaspora. And that's what we need to begin to develop. But I'm not even going to stop there. I'm just going to keep going, because I'm feeling feisty today, all right? So I'm going to look at Black feminism in global context, to begin to look at the multiple forms of feminism that we might think about based on how I'm working and how I am approaching it, right? So that's what we're going to go today, and we'll see where we end up. You ready? You can do it. Come on. You can do it. Right? Okay. Part one. Black feminism and anti-Black racism, the U.S. context. Anti-Black racism in the U.S. context. All right. Survival and freedom. So here's some core ideas for how I think anti-Black racism has happened. Notice I say surviving captivity. Now, in the United States, there were no Black people before slavery, global capitalism, all of that. The whole idea of Black people is something that is constructed from the multiplicity of many experiences to become something called the Black person or Black people, which of course we have claimed and redefined as beautiful. But that was not how it was intended to be. So when you look at the two major existential questions that face Black people in the US, they have been surviving captivity. And I don't want to use the word slave and Black person interchangeably. I don't see it that way. I want us to focus on what it means if someone holds you in captivity. If they hold your body, if they hold your mind, if they hold your soul. They own you. You are not a human being, all right? You are chattel. So surviving captivity to me has been a deep root of the Black experience in the US. It's been a deep root of history, it has social structure, and it's also a metaphor, right? In terms of how one thinks about the world, survival. But there's also resisting captivity. Because when there is social injustice, no matter how bad it looks, there's always someone that says, no, there's gotta be another way, that one's wrong. Just because people who are held captive are silent does not mean they are complicit and agreeing with their own captivity. So in many ways, what we always have resistance traditions that rub up against domination. And I would argue that for the US situation, there is a long-standing freedom struggle. And the term freedom has a special resonance in the United States among Black people because captivity was initially total, but not really. But we see different forms of it, from chattel slavery. Some people would argue that ghettoization is a form of captivity. If you put people together, you lock them up. Some people would argue that mass incarceration is a form of captivity, you see. So in other words, I'm looking at this long arc of this struggle that goes from surviving captivity, because if you don't live, if there's no life there, you have not survived. So surviving is political when you're in a situation like this, and resistance is political. And I have up here the continuum of citizenship, which I can return to later. Was that up there all the time when I talked about that? You didn't see that second one? Resisting captivity, was that up there? No? Okay, look at it for a minute. All right, okay. So you're looking, right? I might have to turn around and see. Okay. There should be 3 things up here. 3, all right, well, all 3. I'm getting it now. All right, so how anti-Black racism works. And this is in some ways how domination works, or how racism works. But anti-Black racism, I think, has been very pernicious and total. Because when you hold people in captivity, you have to figure out a way to get them to stay there and to survive within it. So I have 3 pressure points, or 3 sites where you see the workings of anti-Black racism. Racism that is against Black people. That's what I mean by anti-Black racism. There's first dehumanization that aims to kill the spirit, control the mind, and leave the body behind for domination and exploitation. Now just think about that. When you dehumanize somebody, you say, you're not a person. You don't have a spirit that we are going to respect. You think you have some thoughts? The whole notion of lack of intelligence? No, we want to control your mind, but you're too stupid to make decisions for yourself. And leave the body behind. And the body becomes very important in terms of what kind of body we're talking about. A male body, a female body, what kind of body, a young body, an old body. And leave the body behind for purposes of domination and exploitation. And this is fundamentally what chattel slavery was. That's what that foundation, it tried to do. So domination, once you dehumanize somebody, you don't see them as somebody you have to respect, you don't see them as a person. Domination aims to pervert what I would say is the holistic relationship of body, spirit, and mind. When you are fully whole and you don't have your mind and your body and your spirit working in cross purposes. It's fully you. You're fully there. So the issue is to weaken all of that, because when you do have that holistic relationship, you are much better prepared to resist. Resistance can occur in the mind, it can occur with the body, it can occur with the spirit. It's subjective and it is objective. So domination does not want to see whole people. It doesn't want to see humans. It wants to see categories of people that can be manipulated and exploited. That's the capitalist framework here. Work from sun up to sundown and never get to keep what you produced. Violence is very important for anti-Black racism. As you know much about violence, you know there's a continuum of violence that goes from hate speech to violent acts, to public policies that are in fact violent. For me, when I look at African Americans or Black people in the U.S., I see violence and the threat of death as technologies of domination. And this is the notion that your life is worth so little that we can kill you and it won't matter. Because you don't matter. because we've dehumanized you. So the notion of resistance in this particular situation, the threat of death is really something that keeps people in line. But violence as a technology of domination, and not just as an aberration of an individual, but it's something that is systemic. Now, I would argue that African Americans push back against all of this. And what happens in the institutions where we study and where we teach is that this is the bottom-up view that doesn't rise to the level of theory because of the assumptions that go with dehumanization, domination, and violence. Everybody wants to feel sorry for the poor little black people, all right, who are dehumanized. Oh, I'm with your cause. Oh, yeah, you're dominating. Oh, I feel so bad for you. That's the liberal view. The conservatives say, bring it on. We love it. We want more dehumanization. Domination is normal. Yes. Violence, do we care? Okay, sorry, I got no carry away. I did. I saw it coming and I just had to say something. All right. Let me move on to this next frame because Black freedom struggle, freedom being both a metaphor for freedom, a holistic way of being and living in the world, and freedom actually being a political category that maps onto citizenship in the U.S., there has been an ongoing Black freedom struggle. Decolonizing fits here. Decolonizing just the way, not the way it's used kind of flippantly. Have you noticed everybody wants to decolonize everything now? We don't decolonize chemistry. What's that? We're going to decolonize, I don't know, Starbucks. What's happening? It's sort of an interesting thing that this term that is really attached to a series of political relationships of colonizing the political dimensions, the economic dimensions, and the cultural dimensions is having the meaning scooped out of it, the resistance scooped out of it by the way we're using it flippantly. But here, I am really referring to decolonizing body, mind, and spirit via metaphoric and literal understandings of freedom. What you see in Black history is an attention to the term freedom. Some people are singing about freedom, like Nina Simone. Some people are singing about freedom. You name some singers. Others are really involved in freedom struggle, whether it's civil rights movements or abolitionist movement of slavery, or if it's contemporary issues, I'll get to in a minute. So Black freedom struggle nurtures the spirit by rejecting hegemonic understandings of Blackness and creating self-definitions that value Black humanity. That's how you resist. By the way, that is what I'm doing this minute. Yeah, you with me? Rejecting hegemonic understandings of Blackness that are so pervasive in the Western canon that you often can't even see it. It's so normalized. Something like Black deviance or the racial achievement gap in education. You talk about that up here, or is that just an American thing? Ooh, okay. Oh, Canada. Okay. I believe there's an anthem I should break into at this point. All right. But the notion of creating self-definitions that value Black humanity really speaks to putting Black people in the center of analysis and seeing the humanity and asking very different questions than the kinds of questions that I encountered as a student. See, body politics is defending the integrity of Black bodies and of Black life. So body politics is going to be central to a Black freedom struggle. The survival of Black people as bodies, and freedom as something that is how you want to live your life once you survive. It's not enough to survive, but you don't get the freedom unless you survive. So this is sketching out for you some fundamental vocabulary and a framework that I now want to build on. How are you doing? You doing okay? I like that. Whoever said, yep, I'm doing okay. My personality is. My person, wherever you are, thank you. All right? But Black feminism and Black freedom struggle, I argue that Black feminism emerges from Black freedom struggle. It doesn't come because a group of, I don't know, takes nothing away from privileged white women who have a particular view of feminism. But what bothers me is when people buy into the anti-Black racism and assume that you have no consciousness about your own experience, that you have no analysis of your own experience, that you have no goals about how you're going to work with body, mind, and soul, I guess. You see. So the existential questions that I've introduced you to of captivity, violence, and death take specific form for different parts of the Black population, the Black community. They take different form for men, women, youth, older people. I can just go on and on. Why Black feminism exists? It exists because resisting anti-Black racism requires analyses and actions that take gender and sexuality into account. You have an incomplete resistance to anti-Black racism unless you're beginning to think about gender. Now let me just tell you a little bit about why I would say that. Black male bodies and Black female bodies are quite different from one another. Black women have children. Black women are the ones who are bringing life into this world and recognize the significance of survival. Because once you've created life, or you're supporting the life that other people have created, you take it seriously. It's precious to you. And it's really upsetting if you're someone's mother, if someone sees your life or the life of your child as secondary. That's a side of feminism that is very much under-recognized. Because if you theorize that motherhood is the site of women's depression, you cannot, which it can be, I'm not saying that, but if that's all you see, you miss motherhood as a site of empowerment. You miss the gendered nature of resistance, some of which is targeted to survival, and much of which is focused on freedom. Imagining a future for yourself and for your child that is different than the one you are living. So this intergenerational struggle that I'm alluding to here is part of this existential question of dealing with captivity over time, dealing with violence over time, dealing with the threat of death over time. So Black feminism doesn't exist because somebody showed up one day with a book and said, you know what, y'all are oppressed. Do you realize you Black women are oppressed? You need some feminism. It's right up here in this book. Can I read it to you? I think it's Judith Butler. Or contemporary version. Or and just keep going. It's not that these ideas are to be rejected. It's that they come from a different place than what I'm talking about today. All right? I have to say that again so you don't think I hate all these things. So basically, intersectionality, which is something I've been working on for quite some time, and we'll say a little bit about the question and answer if you're really interested. It takes specific form within Black feminism. It's something that emerges from the need to have an analysis that will help you survive and become free. But it's not something that emerges full-blown. Because one part of being dominated is you don't get to do and say what you want to do all the time. So you have to figure out a way to develop sophisticated arguments that speak to the reality of everyday life and that can move you forward. So, gender, African American women have long been dealing with a gendered discourse. You get gender, you get sexuality, some class, but not as much among Black Americans because the class everybody was born. All right, so the whole notion of a class analysis had to wait until there were, in fact, more rich Black people. Something fell off here. My scarf fell off. Okay. You mean I was just talking so much my clothes fell off? This is the first time that's ever happened. So please somebody tell me if it looks like something else is going to fall off. And I really want you to be my friend on this one. All right. So let me give you an example of this sort of figures, sort of what I mean, two concrete examples in thinking about these broader issues, these philosophical issues, these theoretical issues. It's, the notion of existential Blackness. What does it mean, right? And how women and Black feminism emerges in different periods around these issues. And I would introduce you to the figure of Ida Wells Barnett, who was very much a person who resisted anti-Black racism And really, the anti-black racism at the end of the 1800s, Ida Wells Barnett was born to parents who were slaves. She was born a slave, you see. So her young years, she grew up a free woman. But if you know anything about African American history, freedom was not something that lasted because there was significant pushback. The pushback of today, the people of the day, when we talk about the world is getting so, the right wing, this is the cycle of how this all works, all right? So if you look back to this particular period and look at what Ida Wells Barnett, what she was confronting around violence, dehumanization, and domination, a little bit about her. Wells Barnett was very focused on anti-lynching. She was an anti-lynching activist. Now, a friend of hers, or several of her friends from her neighborhood, were lynched in Memphis, Tennessee. And what got said to her was, she was kind of doing the right thing. She was being a teacher, she was trying to educate the population, she was doing all that. But when people just took these men and killed them, that is really speaking to survival issues. And the intent of this violence was to cow the black population, because these men were successful business people, and they were competing with the grocer. She became an activist that was so fierce that she traveled the world. She was threatened. The citizens of Memphis said if she ever returned, they would lynch her. Right? So she had to go to the north and do this. She became a very powerful anti-lynching activist. That was the catalyst. But in doing that work, she began to develop an analysis of the dehumanization of black people that looked beyond anti-black racism. You see in her work the argument and intersectional analysis of race and gender and sexuality. She said very inflammatory things, because the going ideology at that point in time was that black men were rapists, and what you had to do, they were inherently violent, and that what you had to do was control them, dominate them. If you didn't dominate them, they would revert to type, to violence, and you have to protect the young white women from these men. This is how all the lynching was, in fact, justified. Wells Barnett was very sophisticated. Excuse me, I hate to do that right in there, but I had to cough. She looked at newspaper accounts in the South, because lynchings weren't just random. It wasn't like somebody got up and they were just enraged. Lynchings were planned. They put them in the paper, so everybody could show up with a picnic lunch and watch someone be lynched, like a public execution. That's what they were. They were extra legal. You weren't supposed to be doing that, but there they were. So what she did was she collected evidence from Southern newspapers, where they reported all these lynchings as we came. She used the data gathered by mainstream journalists to get a database about lynching itself. She was really a social scientist and a journalist in a really interesting way. And what you see in her work are inflammatory comments, like, for example, well, if we're going to talk about sexuality, we might want to talk about the sexuality of white men who are in fact raping black women. We might want to talk about that. And if we're going to talk about sexuality, maybe we need to be talking about white women, and perhaps they were complicit, some, in these accusations of whatever. And, well, for this was extremely provocative for the times that she wrote it. Maybe today this would be easier to go down. But my point here is that Ida Wells Barnett and her feminism, she's often not seen as a feminist, because today we associate feminism with somebody who's for women's rights. But Ida Wells Barnett was for a gendered analysis of domination and a gendered analysis of liberation. It's very different than just talking about women. So to me, she's actually a very prominent black feminist, even though she's not given that credit because of the times that we're in. Let me give you another example. You still there? This is like a while ago. I mean, way back in the day kind of thing. Oh yeah, slavery, that kind of stuff. I want to bring these existential questions to the here and now. Resisting anti-black racism. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Now that's today. Violence, dehumanization, domination. The violence, the catalyst of Trayvon Martin's death in 2012. And the aftermath of the person who killed him just getting off. The system did not deliver justice. And the creation of hashtag Black Lives Matter to acknowledge that this is one more black death too many. This is violence, this is captivity, this is domination, this is dehumanization. To not see this teenager as a human, but to see him as a potential thug and threat is part of that whole legacy of dehumanization. You see? The domination of not getting justice in that particular situation is quite palpable. So, what hashtag Black Lives Matter, which sort of began this whole thing, naming it didn't begin it, it named what was already there, right? Was Trayvon Martin was the spark. But the dehumanization, what these women at the bottom, these are some of the founders of hashtag Black Lives Matter, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, was to highlight the humanity of black youth and to say, Black lives matter. Now to say that, when confronted with this whole history of captivity and all these other things, may seem incredibly bold. I see it as a continuation of what's being said for quite some time. It's sort of the next phase of this freedom struggle. And domination, this is the beginning of black feminist analysis and activism that is overtly informed, for this period today, that is overtly informed by intersectionality. If you look at their work, they are talking about expanding the categories of which Black lives matter. It isn't just men and women. It isn't just poor people. It's sexual folk. It is trans women and trans men. It is people who are sex workers. It's all of the black lives. You can't just take the respectable black lives and say those are the ones that matter. Because what counts as respectability has been so refracted through this ideology in this country that to back off of that is, well, anyway, let me just leave that hanging in the air for a minute. But on the left, I have graphics that where you've got the picture of Trayvon Martin saying his name. This is a campaign to say the names of people. And then the solidarity around the hoodie is symbol. Here's this little boy in the middle with his hoodie. The whole notion of the hoodie solidarity. That's kind of interesting where that went, but whatever. And then you also see here, this graphic at the bottom, is my son next? Hashtag Black Lives Matter. You see an upheaval of young black people themselves who say, am I next? But you also see women being very central to this particular movement of Black Lives Matter. It was not started by men. Women were central to this, and black feminism informs this particular movement in some very significant ways. If I move on to the next slide, the shift from hashtag Black Lives Matter to the Black Lives Matter movement, which after Ferguson, Missouri, where yet another young man was shot by the police, and he was left in the street. His body was left in the street, which is a reminder of the dehumanization. And then, of course, Ferguson exploded. Now, this was a very significant incident. I put up in the corner here the book, Making All Black Lives Matter, because we are now at the beginning of getting written work about this particular period of time, because it's, in a lot of ways, still very fresh and still very new. So I put Barbara Ransby's book up here, because Barbara Ransby is a very prominent radical black woman historian. She, I believe, is immediate past president of the National Women's Studies Association. She walks in many circles. She crosses many boundaries, and she argues in this book that this movement is very much affected by black feminism and affected by black women. So I put graphics up here so you could see Ferguson is everywhere, right? The notion of the local being national and being global. Hands up, don't shoot. Justice for Mike Brown. And I also put up Justice for Freddie Gray. That's Baltimore. That happened the following year. And what comes with these two upheavals in rebellions or uprisings of Ferguson and of Baltimore is Ferguson is a town that was very much in white control. All right, because you can look this up and, the whole notion of collecting money from that kind of captivity, all right, when all the laws hold you captive. You get a parking ticket, you can't get out of jail because you can't post bail, because you can't do this and the other. That's captivity too. But what's interesting about Baltimore is a city that's very much run by African Americans. So we have to get away from just thinking evil white people and heroic black people. This is all about anti-black racism as a structure of power, a systemic structure, all right? So, have I convinced you, or a little bit, that you can think a bit differently about black feminism? It's not just the flavor of ice cream within feminism. It actually has a long history with a long memory and a long struggle that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but until this racism goes away, it won't go away. And it also is a struggle that is a little disingenuous to say to black women, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just join the feminist movement? Run away from all those black problems. I just don't know how that even is going to possibly work. Okay. All right, so let's move on. I don't even know why I got so, I like that part. All right, we're now in part 2. Nobody died? It's a good place to be. Part 2, black feminism in black diasporic and global context. And in this section, I'm going to talk about rings of thinking about it. African American feminism in relationship to other groups of black women in different national settings who are undergoing or encountering an anti-black racism that is organized differently because it's refracted through different histories, different colonial powers. For example, speaking English and speaking Portuguese and speaking Spanish and speaking French, you can still get anti-black racism with all that texture, and also different regions of the world. So normally, what often happens is we are encouraged to just jump on, just to provide the experiences of black women as evidence for some bigger theory. So this is the place where what I'm supposed to do is skip over the stage of what about black women talking to one another around the various forms of black feminism, and go immediately to what is considered to be the most significant or more important discussion, which would be feminism writ large. I'm not going to do that. Because I think the next thing to think about is really how can these multiple black feminisms learn from one another and inform one another. They are similar, but they are different. So, just to put up how I'm refreshing our memory here in the black diasporic context. Anti-black racism in global context, I would argue, wherever you are, basically, has similar strategies of domination, dehumanization, and violence. So what you find, whether you are in Soweto, or whether you are in Chicago, or perhaps if you're in Vancouver, I'm not so sure about Vancouver, all right? It's in Vancouver? Okay, well, somebody shouted out, it's in Vancouver, all right? What you find are similar strategies of domination, dehumanization, and violence. You see? So there's a common existential challenge of crafting surviving, and freedom that is differently experienced and resisted. That's what is there to be learned. I mean, I want to go and say, here, I have all the answers for everything. I want to know how you're struggling with anti-black racism. And if there is a black feminism that emerges within that struggle, what does it look like? What does it know that I don't know, and what do I know that you might not know? We are in a period of time now where it is very possible, for the first time in a very, I think ever, for those of us who live in different parts of the globe to talk to one another. Prior to social media, prior to the internet, prior to the web, you couldn't do it. But now the gatekeeping is not there anymore. It's possible now to get information and to talk directly with people who are on the other side of the globe. And that's what's beginning to happen in some interesting ways. So my next chart, Black feminist projects in Black diasporic context. I just put some up here. Now if you look, the box I've been working in is the US Black feminism, which is off to the right. But Afro-Brazilian feminism, Black feminism in South Africa, Afro-Cuban feminism, there's a different political structure around communism, or Black British feminism, for those of you who are privy to the experiences in the UK, where you have a whole unsettled set of ideas around blackness that comes together at one point in time and now becomes something else. Each of these places has its own, what I would call, challenges. These common existential challenges, but they have taken different form. So if we look, for example, if I might, I'm a little nervous about this part because my colleague here is an Afro-Brazilian feminist. I think there's a tad bit, whatever. So I'm going to take a little license and say, I've been fortunate enough to be able to travel to Brazil and learn. And what I discovered was a vibrant Black feminist movement there, with organizations that have been in existence for decades, right? They didn't come and go, they're still there. With people talking to one another from one generation to the next. And a very lively, young Afro-Brazilian population that is open to ideas. Now, it's a similar history. A history of slavery, a history of the Americas and having to craft yourself as a new world Black population. But it's also a distinctive history and much to be learned. So to me, the issue is now having these dialogues and coalitions and debates and discussions among multiple feminisms. Now, this is something that is often very unpopular in the academy, because what we're supposed to do is put everything through the white center and then back out again. All right? Like if you think about some of the American cities, you have the city, and then you have all these train lines coming out. You can't talk to one another. You have to go into the city and then come back out in order to talk to each other. But now, geographically, politically, culturally, we can talk to one another without having to go through the white center. But what tends to happen is people are so used to thinking about white surveillance that it's very hard for them to do that. Let it go. Just let that go. They can wave goodbye to it. Because this is so rich. And this is just one strand of racism that I'm talking about. Just one. Others. So, I got a little carried away there. We move on to my next slide. Here we go. What I see is we now have complexity. We can recognize the complexity and the heterogeneity of Black feminist projects, right, in a global context. How have Black feminist projects been informed by resisting anti-Black racism? That's interesting to me. If you're looking at white settler societies that have been formed after slavery, or that have slavery as part of their history, what does Black feminism look like there? What about white settler societies that have not had slavery, but have basically had conquest? And sometimes you might have an anti-Black racism without actually having Black people of African descent. Because if we think about this as a political category, if you have a group of people who are identifiable as the Black people, they serve the function of the Black people within that particular society. If you think about it just as a political relationship. So to me, however we want to slice into this, I just put this up here to get us thinking about some questions that are not asked, because we're asking other questions instead. The challenge is to build dialogue among these multiple Black feminist projects, right? Now, some challenges to that. Okay, fine, we said that. Okay, I don't need to say that. Okay. Blah, 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 blah. All right? I think I'm going to move on to the next slide. But what I'm doing here is really identifying what those challenges are. Recognizing heterogeneity, they're not the same. Intersectionality as an analytical tool that can accommodate multiple projects if we allow it to do that. And coalition politics. I want to just mention coalitions, which is different than homogeneity. Coalition, once you know your position, then you're ready to have a coalition. It's not a question of we have some general principle that we agree upon and we fight. Right? If you are really working with an anti-Black racism framework and pushing back against that, coalition politics becomes really significant. All right, let me move on. Oh, I'm skipping this slide because I thought I was going to take it out. So you didn't get to see that. All right. And you didn't die. Let's move on a little bit because I want to expand this a bit more and make sure we have time for discussion. What about Black feminism and anti-Black racism in a global context? Let's broaden this even more. Again, notice how I'm working from the particular to the next level to the local level, as opposed to going global, all right? As in local and global are all the same. It doesn't tell me anything, global, right? It could, but it doesn't tell me anything. Black feminism and anti-Black racism in global context. Anti-Black racism is one strand of racism, both within and across nation states. This is how I think we should begin to think about many of these categories, these isms that we're sort of used to throwing around and just feeling very good about ourselves because we went to school and we can just say the terms, coloniality, yes, I did it key, kind of thing, all right? Instead, let's really dig into each of these categories and develop analyses of what they mean. So in this case, I've been working with anti-Black racism is one strand of racism, both within nation states and across nation states. Now you have to understand, nation states are very important to race and racism because they regulate the categories, the population categories. Right? They decide who is Black and who isn't. We're about ready to have a census in 2020 in the US. Lots of fighting about this, all right? So I believe some countries didn't have race. Some of the Latin American countries, we don't have race. That means we don't have any Black people because we don't count them. This is a fascinating form of denial to me, all right? It really speaks to the period that, you can tell I'm not really in the realm of colorblind racism. I never bought into it. As in, we've outlawed it, therefore it's gone, so let's just all be colorblind. I don't see color. Oh, I don't see color. Well, what? This makes no sense to me. So, nation states are very significant in what they can do because that's the container that contains your citizenship, that contains your race, that regulates your movement from one place to another, and your rights, your citizenship rights. So I don't turn my nose up at nations and just assume that because the world is global, that somehow nations and nationalism are going to wither away. I think they're actually sites of political contestation, big time. And to seed those sites, you're really seeding the power that you have. Now here, some other strands. Indigenous peoples. I'm in Canada. We started off with acknowledging one particular indigenous group. But talk about the globe there, both within Canada, the US, New Zealand, Australia, what am I missing? Brazil with Amazonia, and across the globe, and the potential there. Racialized immigrant peoples, the people who leave one country and migrate to another and discover they're part of a racial group that they didn't even know existed. I think this happens a lot in the US. With our Asian populations who were not Asian before they left. They were Chinese, they were Korean, they were Thai, they might have been South Asian. But when they get to the US, all of a sudden they're Asian. And what does that mean in terms of the history of the US and the nature of the kind of racism that has happened in the US against immigrants of color? You see. In the US, when the Irish and the Italian came, they were immigrants of color. But they have since become white, as this wonderful elastic category of whiteness expands when you need more white people, and contracts when you don't need them anymore. All right? So this fascinating category in the US of whiteness and Latinos. When we have workers, as long as they stay Latino, well, the white ones are okay with them. You get this really interesting framework within Latinos in terms of Puerto Ricans being racialized, Dominicans being racialized Latinos, and other Latinos, perhaps from Argentina, not so much so. But it is the US, and I can talk about US history. The political blackness that I referred to before, populations that are ethnically and phenotypically identifiable, that become the markers of the bottom of your society, whatever it is. And I just had I really had a wonderful experience 2 days ago hanging out with my new friends, learning a lot about the Romani people in Europe, all right, known in quotation marks, the pejorative term, the gypsies, okay, and what's going on there in terms of the parallels between Romani people and black people in terms of demographics. Fascinating. And I could continue to add to this list. So instead of having this racism that has these sort of universal characteristics, I think we need to talk about multiple racisms and really do the homework of taking various groups where they are and building from the bottom up. What does racism look like among different populations, in different nations, at different periods of time, which I haven't talked about very much today. And for feminism, how has resisting racism informed other feminist projects? How has it informed feminist projects? Rather than picking one and thinking it's the penultimate best one, what's the connection among diverse feminist projects? Resisting racism through multiple feminist projects. What would it look like? Now, my little box of Black Diasporic Feminisms, you saw how hard I worked to just fill in that box, starting with the particular and moving to diasporic and giving you a sense of just the texture there. That's all the wonderful work that needs to be done. But what about indigenous feminisms? And notice, white Western feminisms are but one box of men in a very big world. You still with me on this? So I'm not dealing with this question anymore about what's the difference between white feminism and black feminism. I'm not answering that question, all right? Because the work that needs to be done is really the work that I brought to you today in terms of how I think we need to be working with these multiple feminist projects. And what we will find within each of those projects are patterns of privilege and disadvantage. But since I started with anti-black racism, that's really a site of domination, dehumanization, and violence that parallels the experiences of other groups. But we have to come to terms with the multiple boxes that really need to be on this particular page. This is a world of heterogeneity, multiplicity, and thinking about things differently. So, summing up, new directions. Using the particular as one path to the universal. That's what I've done today. I've used the particulars of Black women's experiences as the path to universal existence. Okay? Bottom-up analyses that are grounded in the lived experiences of people and their ideas versus top-down imposition of theories that are developed in the imagination of decontextualized folk. I want to say something else, but I can't say that. All right? Let me just let that sit for a minute. Second, strengthening intersectionality as a navigational tool for intellectual and political coalition building. Now, I have just slogged my way through a very difficult book, the book that Jade mentioned, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, where that is what I try and do. It's basically to say, rather than assuming we all know what intersectionality is, and we feel kind of self-righteous because we're using it, what is it? Can it be a navigational tool for the kind of intellectual and political coalition building that I've described here? Can it be a language? Can it be a vocabulary? How can we use it? And finally, deepening ideals of freedom. And the view of freedom that I'm presenting to you today is an ideal. It is not a reality. Freedom that is not based on someone else's subordination. Can you imagine that? That's going to be freedom. None of us will see that in our lifetimes. But what we can do is dedicate our work to that particular goal. Thank you very much.
So much, and we do want and encourage
anyone wants to use it.
You know, it's okay, people. It really is. Take a breath. Don't make me call on somebody. More about the function of what? Of blackness? You know, it's almost like the blackness is the antithesis of whiteness. You cannot have whiteness without blackness, right? It has no meaning. So, I think, let's see more about it. Yes, oh, the political blackness. Yeah, I think that, there we go. All right, that, we move in a different direction with that. I think we have to be really careful not to consider blackness as the same thing as people of African descent and phenotypes. Now, in reality, the people who are politically black are in fact people who look black. But looking black is different from one place to the other, from one society to the other. So, in some of my work, I try to distinguish between political blackness and what I call a cultural blackness or whatever. But it's a hard sell because these categories are coterminous, right? So I think it's important for us to not slide into the notion that blackness is all about shared culture, that blackness is not all about shared appearance, but blackness might very much be about shared oppression. And that the challenge for New World blacks, which is how I would refer to African Americans, and black people in North America and in South America, is creating an identity that claims that blackness that is given to you and that redefines it and revalorizes it. And I think that's a different project than if one is in continental Africa, right, where there are different issues that go on. So in some ways, because we are New World citizens, we are the ones who are really shaping our identity. But others have a lot at stake for us not valorizing blackness because it upsets them. So the power relations are quite significant. Some people want to do away with, like, let's just do away with race altogether. Let's just stop believing in it. Well, there's too much history, right? This is what we've got. So we've got to redefine in the same way that I think blackness has to be redefined. That's what black people have done to survive. White people have to say to themselves, if you happen to be a white person here, what kind of white person am I? How do I revalorize whiteness so it's not associated with all this stuff? It's a very different way of thinking about yourself as white. And if you don't think, well, I'm outside of that black-white binary, that has to do with other people. It's global at this point. So we have many populations that are in the middle who experience some forms of racism but are also privileged. The model minorities, that kind of thing. So while I was talking very particularly about blackness, because what happens with blackness is everybody wants you to wait. I mean, but everybody else, and you go last, all right? And I decided, I'm not doing that. We're going first. And you know, I'm going to find a way to go first, and everybody else can just figure it out, right? So this is definitely a topsy-turvy turn on its head type talk, right? Very different. There's a lot of tropes that you would bring into a talk that I didn't use. I didn't use race relations. I just didn't do it. I did something else. But centering in blackness and revalorizing blackness and thinking about black humanity and reclaiming that derogated term, it's really similar to the Black Power movement. Oh, you know, now we're not supposed to say the word nigger. Oh, I said it. Did anybody die? We say the N-word, you know, that kind of thing. There were people who claimed blackness and said, I'm black and I'm proud. And that was considered, kind of thing. So claiming the terms that are against you, and it's more than a term, it's actually the power, and taking the power back from those terms, is, I think, a part of all of this. I'm going to double back in a few minutes and say some more about this, but right behind you there with the mic.
Hello.
Hello.
So my question has to do with the local-global dynamics. So you mentioned this idea that, we have globalism, so now we don't have to worry about like political. And then I was thinking about the opposite that people often deploy of like, oh well, globalism is dying, and we have all this rising nationalism in the world, so like let's ignore globalism. And I was wondering if you had anything to speak on that, especially because as we can see, like this denial of globalism still goes hand in hand with anti-blackness. So.
Well, see, the issue is you have to think about who is globalism good for, all right? So it cuts both ways. I mean, a lot of what we're calling right-wing nationalism and sort of resurgence are people who genuinely didn't benefit from globalism, all right? So these aren't, they're not making it up. I mean, unfortunately, it's wrapped up in racism and a lot of other difficult issues. But if you want to look at the material conditions of who's gotten left behind, all right? So it's not surprising to me. I mean, the whole thing of attaching the local to the global always, and all points in between, and not leaving the nation state out. Because I think we now recognize the importance of the nation state and national policy in between. But what I was trying to get at was that there's a phrase, all politics are local. Right? And they really are in terms of what you care about and what you fight for and all of that. And a lot of the politics that come out of anti-black racism are in fact local. They are politics where people are organizing their communities. I mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement that was, when Ferguson erupted, people, let me back up. Trayvon Martin, Ferguson, all of that, people recognize their own local situation in other local places. So it was felt as, and that was my child, or that was out in the street. So we're now in a position to keep the specificity of those local organizational efforts, but to recognize that they're far bigger than our neighborhood and our block, and think about how to strategically use and survive within those nation states that come in between. So, 10 years ago when I was hearing from my colleagues who were in the, they were enthralled with colorblind racism, and there's no colorblind racism, we're all colorblind now, and we just have to stop doing away with race, and then we won't have racism anymore. We had Barack Obama in the U.S., that was really how it came down the road. We have a black president, what more do people want? Give it up, right? Aren't you creating racism by continuing to talk about racism? I just thought, well, let's just see how this goes, right? And using the Obama administration, which was far from perfect, but using that administration as a marker from one set of aspirations, the global, colorless, we're all one Coke commercial of cosmopolitanism and globalization that way, and recognizing the unevenness of that and what happens in local communities. And a lot of what is happening politically is coming from local communities, and is exploited, quite frankly, by politicians who see that pain, but who, they know how to benefit from it. Right? So I don't know, it seems like it's an opportunity for us to rethink those ties, now that everyone's attention has been gotten, sadly. So I actually, it's going to sound terrible, but I think the election of Donald Trump was really a big wake-up call for a lot of people. And I don't think that's any longer the case. So. Just put those hands up, because, they have to sprint over here to find you. It's a big room.
Hi, I feel a little awkward asking this question, but it's kind of been in my mind recently. Here in Canada, I'm sure like in the US, there's a lot of just acknowledgement around like indigenous issues, around the environment and all aspects of indigenous ways of being, what's going on. And so with that, for me, I've noticed conversations about like what does it mean to be Black in Canada, and there's this conversation: are we settlers or are we not settlers? And I don't think, I think that this speaks to me something that you said about framing everything through settler colonialism and looking to whiteness as kind of like the central idea. So it's been like a really challenging conversation and thought process for me. So I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts or ideas about that.
You see, I think if you start with a couple ways of looking at it, you can sort of think about what you have in common. And sometimes this is the coalition theme. And often you discover, well, you're so different. My gosh, you're interested in this, we're doing this, you can see the differences, which would lead one to call Black people in Canada Black settlers, right? And indigenous folk like the real authentic people, right? That kind of thing. But you can, if you look at it in terms of what you have in common in terms of political subordination and domination and dehumanization and violence, it sounds like the same story to me, right? Only different details. And sort of going after different aspects of indigenous life. And the major one to me is separating people from the land, right? And what the land means, my understanding, limited as it may be, of indigenous epistemologies, right? Or ways of looking at the world. So, and of course the whole notion of violence is so similar. Really, the notion of genocide against the population is really, how can we forget that? The efforts to do that. So I think that there's plenty of space for coalition among people who learn each other's histories, right? And think about, that's exactly what I'm arguing for here, right? And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not there yet, but I may not get there because there's a lot I don't know still. But learning each other's histories and thinking about what are those various histories in Canada. Something like this lovely book, The Book of Negroes, all right, probably should be on the indigenous reading list, all right? So there are, and vice versa. I'm sure there are books like that sort of talk about indigenous life in Canada. I mean, I can't believe there's scholarship on this. There are people who do this, they know this. So for me, a lot of this is really us telling our own stories to each other, and then telling our own stories to other people, and listening to other stories. If I would get into that sort of touchy-feely narrative place I'm not often in, right? But to me, being Black in Canada has got to be inflected by all of that, okay? But that also involves conflict. I'm not necessarily, conflict is something we have to be comfortable with. And we have to be willing to look at our own position. I shared this story yesterday, I'll just share it now because it seems appropriate, when I was going to the UK. And these were some of the novelty. I had not been in the UK, and I was giving my little talk on Black feminism. I thought it went really well, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, so what's it like being a Black American imperialist? I said, I was kind of like, it would be similar to what's it like being a Black settler on my land? I mean, it's kind of like, so I mean, at some point you have to be prepared to say, well, where did that come from? And let me learn that, because I think that is all about American imperialism that may be spreading throughout the world in a Black way as well. And let me pay attention to that. But had that person not said that to me, I would not have known. Or had I been just resentful and just said, well, later for you, whatever it is. So I think this is a very important question around coalitions, especially the ones where people may not want to hear from you, or you have to look at how you're not ready to hear from them. But a lot of this is patience and seeing the commonalities. All right.
I think there's a question back here. Guys, do you have a question?
This might go off.
There you go. Probably when I bent over, I just disconnected something. So I'm just going to hold on to this as we do.
This question is more about, it has to do a little more direct.
Can you give him the mic? I really can't hear you. They're standing right here.
My question
This
has
is anti-Black racism.
They cut the mics on us? Oh, this is wrong. All right, so just do your best.
Oh, this is turned on. Okay. Our question is to do somewhat with current affairs, considering there are, the field of Democrats are expanding. What are your thoughts on reparations as a tool to sort of make up for captivity and slavery and a history of racism with a country like the United States?
You know, I think some countries have a much better chance of getting reparations than others. Right? And this is, I know that people in the UK attempting to do this, and they've really been able to trace the wealth more precisely because it's a smaller land mass. I, for one, am not optimistic. I think it's a worthy cause, but I'm not optimistic. I really think we're dealing with, I mean, the way I present this is we're dealing with the origins of America as hardwired into three categories that are formed. Whiteness from all those immigrant groups, blackness that's formed from many African groups, and indigenous folk from many of the people. I mean, it's a big country. So to put all that back in the bottle, and plus layer it on with immigration afterwards, all right? So the foundational triangle and then waves of immigration that has to figure out how it's going to fit into that. I just think it's too, and when you start asking for money, because reparations are money. So the difficulty of tracing these particular issues, but how do we trace it back? To a few families who can really claim within the American legal system that they're entitled to the wealth that was built on their backs. This is a system where people who were held in captivity didn't even have names. All right, when people are doing their genealogies in the US, this is a chattel slavery. It's not like it would be like if your animal had your cow or your mule or whatever, had a name and had a father and a family. Is it better?
Obviously, this is the question of the day, because we're having trouble with the mics on both ends. You do realize I have my own person to do this, right?
Okay, here we go. So now I'm not supposed to move very much at all. So I would love to think that maybe there's a way to move forward, but I would prefer something where we're actually investing in institutions of some kind. Rather than reparations often, under the legal system is someone took for example, Jewish people being compensated. Someone took my grandfather's picture and we traced it, the lineage and how you should pay me. And I just think that's going to be very difficult in the U.S., particularly with all the mixing and how do we do it. But that doesn't mean that we should just walk away from repairing the harm that's been done in different ways, all right, that are monetary. So I could be optimistic, but I'm not. But I want to be wrong on this. I want to be wrong.
Hi. Here.
Raise your hand so I can find you. There you are. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Is it on? Okay, so I'm a bit ashamed to ask the question because it indicates a certain degree of laziness on my part of not having read your book yet on intersectionality. But I'm just wondering if you could speak. I was just wondering if you could.
I think we're going to have to use your outside voice.
I'm just wondering if you could possibly speak to the ways in which intersectionality has been co-opted by institutions, particularly universities, and how we might mount resistance to that in our places of work and study.
I've just spent, I'd say 18 months writing a book about this exact thing, right? And while I was laboring in my little house and weeping and crying because it was so hard to write, I had to remind myself of why it was important to do. Because for me, I want to get out in front of the appropriation. You have to look at who's coming after your stuff. First of all, intersectionality didn't get popular until a couple of years ago. So while we were working under the radar, it was great. Okay, there was a lot of freedom, you had a lot of conversations, and all of a sudden in the US, Hillary Clinton claimed intersectionality and life changed overnight. It's interesting. But I use that tongue in cheek, but I also think that what happens in the academy, and here is the right way, this would be my opinion, but we have in the academy colonization of ideas. So anytime anybody has an idea, you have many academics who really don't have new ideas, all right, who are not doing anything innovative. They're following you around trying to take your stuff. Now, and then often without attribution. That's the other piece. So I think that now that I saw how that works, I thought it's time for me to get out in front of this and to say if it's going to be our field, we have to talk seriously about what it is. We can't just defend it from other people. Because that's the whole thing. Get your hands off my intersectionality. I mean, that buys you time. That's about it. All right. So what I've done is just finished a book where I'm looking at if intersectionality is going to be a discourse that now can move forward. We've had this wonderful period of experimentation and finding one another and adding and chatting and all this kind of stuff. What does it mean for us to get down to work and ask, what is at the intellectual core of this field? And for me, that means you have a theoretical core. That is not just introducing somebody else's theory into your work and kind of retrofitting it to the project that you have. For me, intersectionality is something that comes from many different places, therefore it is heterogeneous. This talk I just gave you is also very much about intersectionality in terms of its path, right? So the question is, once you get people in the crossroads, once you get them in the intersection, once you get them in the coalition, whatever kind it is, how do you then think about what it is you're doing there? That's the next step. How do we translate across these various projects? What's going to hold us together? And what's the theoretical core that's going to be there? The way I approach it is to ask about intersectionality as critical social theory. Now, that's another word that's losing meaning. Critical everything. It's somehow different than the other thing. All right? When I had a colleague who asked me, I said, well, we have a critical race initiative. He said, well, I do race. Can you tell me if my race is critical? My point is, if you had to ask this question and you do not know what it was. All right, so I mean, I just thought, well, okay, so-and-so. Okay, all right? So it's the same notion, critical social theory. What does it mean for us to ask the kinds of questions that might be associated with social justice projects? What does it mean for us to be critical of our own work? What does it mean to think outside the box of where we get our ideas from and valorize theorizing that does not occur in the academy, where you have to actually push back against the epistemologies themselves? What does it mean? What are the things we should be thinking about? For example, one of the hardest chapters I had to write in that book was on relationality, because this is another one where mainstream scholars have run in. We must have relational this, we have relational sociology. But you don't find anything about power anywhere in that. It's somehow about some kind of apolitical relationships among the field. So to really say what are important ideas that need to be at the center of this discourse, and how do we go about getting there? One of them for me was social justice. I asked the question, can you have intersectionality without social justice? Because everybody assumes I'm using an intersectional framework and therefore it's socially just. Don't make that assumption. We have to make that case. And what would that case look like if we made it? So I present a counterfactual of an intersectional argument that is clearly not about social justice, and that would be the case of eugenics. And eugenics really very nicely maps onto nationalism today. So it's timely again, and it also maps onto fascism. So there's some very interesting things that can be intersectional, and they can be effective because they're intersectional. But they're not what you have in mind around social justice, freedom, emancipation, all those ideals. We have to think about how to put ideals back in our work. I mean, I, for one, mourn the loss of grand narratives and big ideas. All right? I want freedom back as an idea. Notice it was in my talk? Okay? So I'm not into deconstructing anything else except some stuff I don't like. All right? I want to construct some stuff. That, we got to build things and not just deconstruct. Where's my girl over here? There you are. I wanted to say that to you. More than deconstruction. All right. So anyhow, I got a little impassioned about that because I have been freed from my house where I've been stuck at that computer for a very long time. And I was not convinced that I would be able to get a sentence out about it. It just was so hard to get a holistic argument into a uniform. But I think this is the moment to do it. And I think I've bought us some time. And if intersectionality becomes kind of a term that came and went, it's our fault.
Maybe just, it's 7:30, maybe just 2 more questions. So there's one right here.
Good, go ahead.
Oh.
I don't know where to look. That here, and then you got your minute, but you really have a burning question. So
Yeah, it's working. Sometimes. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
So I think you already kind of addressed this already, but just to press the matter a bit more, I think especially in a place like Vancouver, I think it's it's a bit more, it's somewhat acutely felt the very Asian brand of anti-blackness. And I think it's the kind of thing that Afro-pessimism kind of points to as like obstacles to coalition, like building coalitions. So I was wondering if, the things that you're saying about like multiple racisms and multiple feminisms, do you think, and I guess intersectionality, do you think that that's sort of strong enough to sort of overcome that kind of obstacle?
What other choice do we have? What other choice do I have other than to fight that? Do I become an Afro-pessimist and sit around being black and pessimistic? That creates problems for other people. You give me the Afro-futurist any day. That's who I want. The people who are looking to the past, to think about the present, to imagine a new future, right? Now, if there is an Asian anti-black racism in there, I would say, which Asians are we talking about? This would be a similar thing I'd say about white people. Which white people are we talking about? So, because it's complicated, doesn't mean that we just can decide on the front end how it's going to turn out. You don't know until you get to the next step how things are going to look, right? So to me, there's dignity in the process. My talk was all about struggle. You notice how much I use the term struggle. And a struggle without end is kind of that we can see, is a very depressing idea for young people. Because they want victory next week, or preferably tomorrow. So this whole notion of dignity in struggle, and that's basically choosing life, a life of struggle, in a lot of ways is women are very good at this, which is why I'm talking about feminism a lot too. Not because there's some natural maternal instinct, but because I think women have experiences that predispose us to say, what choice do I have? When they locked up my husband, what choice do I have other than to keep this family going? So if it's not for me, maybe you can do better next generation. Right? Immigrant families are very much like this too, by the way, who come with very little. It may not be good, I may not get there, but it's a better life for you. But the issue is for the better life not to buy into the model of domination and to mistake your freedom based on somebody else's domination for real freedom. Okay? So, yeah, I guess I did kind of answer it, but I'm glad you asked me again. We're already cute. She had her hand up. She was really passionate up here. She was waving it.
Hi. So I'm also American. I was just wondering, kind of go back to the question about reparations. Do you think it's unlikely that reparations be made like on a more national level by the government? Is there a way that reparations can be made on a more individual level? Or could you answer or kind of elaborate on the other ways you feel like reparations can be made, still using money, but like investing in?
Well, the redistribution of wealth. I mean, we're going the wrong direction. Global economic inequality is worse than it was a generation ago. So, I mean, if we really had, and also sort of moving people into the mindset that I'm an individual, everything is individualistic. I also do work on community, the whole concept of community as a political construct, and not just a warm, fuzzy space. So I'm the one that really would argue for a redistribution of wealth to communities and not to individuals. And to think about how we're going to have responsible stewards of those communities and of that money, if we were to get it. Now, I think that's actually a question down the road. When you think about going the opposite direction, and you think about the fact that in the U.S. the tax structure is changing quite dramatically, and we've had a big tax bill, and now it's a little different than it was before. And we have somebody who believes in the privatization of public schools, which is very much extracting public resources that Black and Latino and immigrant children need. And you've certainly seen the horror stories at the border, you know. So, I mean, reparations almost seems kind of theoretical to me, right? In relation to the sort of realities, those realities. But thinking big is always a good idea. And thinking big in terms of what sounded like maybe a crazy idea yesterday is no longer one today. So that's how I look at reparations. And we'll figure out what makes sense. Excuse me.
Oh, it's a question back here, yes.
Hi, one of our audience members handed me a question to ask you. Could you please speak to how to address the anti-Black racism which can be prevalent within the Black community, especially with biracialized, such as white and Black background, and for example, African American, Canadian, Caribbean, and other Black populations?
Nobody says that racism is something that white people have a monopoly on. This is one of the greatest, really one of the saddest issues. When you have people who are basically trying to prove their Blackness on the backs of somebody else. Notice how I said freedom cannot be based on someone else's subordination, right? So the whole notion of a Black identity or someone who has great difficulties against dealing with the Black people for one reason or another, those are the people who are harmed by racism, they're in fact damaged. Those are the ones who've been dehumanized. And somehow they feel that that entitles them to do unto others as what was done unto them. So now the whole notion of how you intervene in that, and it depends on what the context is the context an academic context, is it a work context, is it a neighborhood context? Excuse me. And it also depends on the fortitude of those people who say, wait a minute, you're calling me not Black? I'm Black. I'm politically Black. I may be more politically Black than you. The whole notion of getting an easy pass just because you look a certain way as a Black person, or you've had a certain kind of experience, it doesn't work that way. I don't think. So in a lot of ways, I acknowledge that that's an issue. All right, that's an important issue. But I don't think that's the main issue, or I would have been talking about it. Because in some ways, that's the issue institutions like this want us to talk about. That's divide and conquer. All right? So the issue is to deal with the divisions openly, honestly, exert leadership when leadership can be exerted. And I think the leadership is there. Basically, movement for Black lives, there's a lot of stuff going on there. But if you look at the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and you look at, actually you go to the website of the movement for Black lives, there's a vision that says, we want to be inclusive. So there's lots of ways to push back against that. But it is still very painful to people who are, where the effort is to make them feel lesser. That's a painful situation, and I'm just going to call it wrong. Knock it off. Don't do that. Grow. Get out of the way. Let others lead.
Thank you.
I think this might be, are we winding down?
Yes.
If I'm holding this up, I'm afraid to move it. I noticed it's a